Hey everyone, thanks for watching. Lately, YouTube hasn't been recommending my videos to more viewers, and it gets exhausting pushing against that. Over 95% watch without dropping a like, and it really helps the channel and keeps me motivated to make more scary content. It takes a second, but it helps the channel a lot. Now, let's begin. This story came from a guy named Grant who has spent the better part of 30 years fishing the deep, winding tributaries of the Appalachian Mountains. He told me that when you spend that much time in the woods, you develop a sense for what's normal and what isn't. You learn the language of the forest, the way birds go quiet when a predator's near, or how the water ripples differently before a storm rolls in. But Grant said that on a Tuesday in early April, he realized he didn't know the woods nearly as well as he thought. He said the scariest thing isn't being alone in the wilderness. It's the moment you realized you've been invited into a game you didn't know you were playing. The morning started out perfect. I'd hiked about 2 miles into a remote section of the Greenbrier River, a place where the water's clear as glass and the only sound is wind moving through the hemlocks. I was targeting smallmouth bass with a light spinning rod and a few soft plastic lures. About 30 minutes in, I landed a decent fish, solid 12-incher. But what caught my attention wasn't the size. It had this very distinct scar, a deep white V-shaped notch on its left gill plate, probably from a heron or snapping turtle when it was younger. Unique mark, impossible to mistake. I snapped a quick photo, unhooked it, and watched it dart back into the shadows under a submerged rock. I decided to move. I like to keep walking when I fish, cover as much water as possible. I hiked about half a mile upstream, pushing through a thicket of laurel until I hit a deep, slow-moving pool. On my third cast, I felt a familiar tug, reeled it in. As the fish broke the surface, I got this weird jolt of recognition. Same bass, same V-shaped scar, same size. I stood there, knee-deep in cold water, just staring at it. I was at least half a mile from where I'd caught it maybe 10 minutes ago. Bass are territorial, sure, but they can move. I figured maybe it was a fluke. Maybe it followed the lure upstream. Maybe the current pushed it along. Unlikely, but not impossible. I released it again, watched it swim toward the center of the river, and decided to push further. I hiked another 20 minutes, crossed a ridge, and dropped back down to a bend that required scrambling over some jagged limestone. I was nearly 2 miles from where I started. 10 minutes later, I caught it again. Same fish, same white scar. This time, I didn't feel the thrill. I felt this cold, prickling sensation on the back of my neck. I looked at the fish in my hand, gill plate pumping steadily. My brain started scrambling for logical explanations. Maybe I was catching a different fish with a similar scar. I pulled out my phone and compared the live fish to the photo from the first spot. Identical. Every scale, every fleck of gold in the eye. Same animal. I felt this deep crawling unease, like the world was stuck on repeat, like I was trapped in some kind of glitch. I released the fish, but this time I didn't keep fishing. I sat down on a boulder and just watched the water, waited 20 minutes trying to settle my nerves. Told myself I was overthinking it, sun playing tricks, exhausted brain. I decided to run a test, packed up, and hiked 3 miles back toward the trailhead, stopping at this shallow run that was almost completely cut off from the main channel by a sandbar, a place no bass would naturally be. I cast, and within seconds, line went taut. I reeled it in slow, hands shaking. When the fish came into view, I felt sick. It was the bass. That V-shaped scar practically glowed against the dark water. I didn't release it this time, walked it over to a small tide pool in the rocks and let it go there where it was trapped. I needed to see if it would stay. I sat on the bank, heart hammering against my ribs, stayed there a full hour watching that fish swim circles in that little puddle. It didn't disappear, didn't change. I started thinking I was losing my mind. Wondered if I was having some kind of neurological episode, hallucinating the whole day. I felt this desperate need to just sit down, away from the water, and collect myself, ground myself in something solid. I walked about 50 yards from the bank into a small clearing, tall dead grass and old rotting timber. Found this large moss-covered log lying in the shade of a massive oak. Looked like it had been there for decades. Thick, heavy, blanketed in deep green moss and gray lichen. I sat down on it, leaned my elbows on my knees, head in my hands, closed my eyes, focused on breathing, trying to drown out the sound of the river. That's when everything stopped. I felt a subtle vibration beneath me. At first, I thought it was just me shivering, but then I realized the movement was rhythmic, a slow, steady rise and fall. Expand, contract, expand, contract. The log was breathing. The realization didn't hit all at once. It filtered in through horrifying layers. I felt heat coming off the surface, dull, organic warmth that shouldn't belong to dead wood. I reached down, fingers brushing the moss, and realized it wasn't moss at all. It was tattered, filth-caked strands of synthetic fabric. I stood up so fast I nearly fell over, backed away, eyes wide, watching the log. A man was lying there. He was wearing a ghillie suit, full-body camo made to look like the forest floor. But this wasn't some clean, store-bought outfit. It was caked in real mud, dried leaves, what looked like animal hair. He was lying perfectly face down in the dirt, arms tucked tight against his sides. So still, so perfectly blended into the earth that I'd walked right past him 3 times without noticing. As I watched, he slowly began to move. Didn't jump up, didn't reach for a weapon, just slowly turned his head to the side, pressing his cheek into the muck. Through gaps in the camo netting, I saw one eye, bloodshot, yellowed, fixed directly at me. He didn't say anything, didn't need to. I looked down at his hands, partially buried in leaves. Next to him, lying in the dirt, a small collapsible nylon bucket, filled with water. And inside that bucket, I saw the flash of a gold and green flank. The realization hit like a punch to the gut. This man hadn't been following me. He'd been ahead of me the whole time. Every time I moved, he'd been moving through the brush parallel to the river, faster, quieter than I ever could. He'd been catching that same fish, or maybe he'd had it the whole time, and he was feeding it to me. He'd been watching from the bank, waiting for me to cast, then somehow, God knows how, making sure I caught that specific fish over and over. He was gaslighting me, playing with my sense of reality, watching from the shadows as I slowly spiraled. He wanted to see how many times it would take before I broke. The man's mouth moved slightly, cracked lips parting just enough to show his teeth. He let out this low, wet wheeze that might have been a laugh. "Consistent," he whispered, voice like gravel grinding together. "You're very consistent." I didn't wait for another word. I turned and ran, didn't follow any trail, just crashed through the woods, branches tearing at my clothes, briars ripping my skin. Didn't care about the gear I'd left, didn't care about the truck, just needed to be away from that breathing earth and the man who played games with fish. Made it back to the main road about 2 hours later, flagged down a passing car. I was covered in mud and scratches, looking like a lunatic. The driver took me to the local sheriff's office. I told them everything. They went out there the next day, found my rod, my tackle box, found the clearing and the spot where the man had been lying. They found the log-shaped depression in the mud, but the man was gone. And in the middle of that depression, lying in the dirt, was the bass, dead, V-shaped scar, dried and white. Someone had carefully laid it there, right where my head would have been if I'd laid down to rest. Sheriff told me they'd had reports of a bushman in those mountains for years, someone living off the grid who liked harassing hikers and hunters, but they'd never caught him. He knew the terrain too well, knew how to disappear into the gray and green until he was nothing more than a shadow. I haven't been fishing since. Can't look at a river without wondering what's moving underneath the surface. Can't look at a fallen tree without waiting for it to breathe. This story came from a guy named Theodore. He spent most of his life working in a furniture factory in North Carolina, but his real passion was always fishing. He told me that for a fisherman, there's a specific kind of peace you find at 4 in the morning. The world hasn't quite woken up yet, and the water looks like a sheet of dark glass. But Theodore said that after one morning on a remote lake in the Blue Ridge Mountains, he realized the silence of dawn isn't always empty. Sometimes that silence is just waiting for you to make the first move. The lake I'm talking about doesn't have an official name on most maps. Locally, we just call it Blackwood Basin. It sits deep in a valley where the mountains rise up like jagged teeth on all sides. Difficult place to get to. 2-mile hike down a goat path with your gear on your back, which is exactly why I loved it. You could spend 12 hours there and never see another soul. It was a Thursday in late September. The sky was heavy, suffocating gray. Low-hanging clouds that seemed to scrape the tops of the pines. No wind, which made the air feel thick. I got to the shore just as the first hint of gray light was bleeding through the clouds. I pushed my small wooden rowboat into the water. The sound of the hull sliding over wet pebbles was loud, almost jarring in the absolute quiet. I rowed out toward the center, oars making that rhythmic creak slosh, that usually puts my mind at ease. Once I reached my favorite spot, a deep shelf near the eastern bank, I let the boat drift. I sat there for a moment, just breathing in the dampness. I looked across the lake, scanning the opposite shore about 400 yards away. Everything was still. There was nothing but the dark silhouettes of the trees and the mist clinging to the water's edge. I began to rig my line, my fingers moving with the muscle memory of 30 years. About 5 minutes passed. I was just about to make my first cast when I glanced up again. There was a boat on the opposite side. I felt a slight prickle of confusion. I hadn't heard a single sound. No oars hitting the water, no hull scraping the rocks, no heavy breathing of a hiker. In a place this quiet, you can hear a pebble drop from 100 yards away. But there it was, a dark, flat-bottomed skiff sitting perfectly still against the tree line. I squinted. The light was still poor, and the fog made everything look like a smudge of charcoal. I could see the shape of a person sitting in the boat. They were dressed in dark clothing, wearing a wide-brimmed hat that obscured their face. They weren't fishing. They were just sitting there, facing my direction. I'm the kind of guy who likes his privacy, but I also don't like awkwardness. In the mountains, if you see someone else out in the middle of nowhere, you acknowledge them. It's a safety thing, mostly. I raised my hand and gave a slow wave. "Good morning," I shouted. My voice rolled across the water, echoing off the rock faces of the gorge. A few seconds later, the figure in the boat responded, but it wasn't a good morning or a wave back. The person shouted something in a language I didn't recognize. It was harsh and guttural, a string of rhythmic syllables that sounded like stones being ground together in a hopper. The tone wasn't friendly, but it wasn't quite a threat either. It was just loud. I sat there for a second, my hand still halfway in the air. I've lived in these mountains my entire life. I know the local families, the tourists, and the seasonal workers. We have people from all over, sure, but hearing a foreign tongue shouted across a remote mountain lake at 5 a.m. felt completely out of place. It felt wrong, like seeing a tropical bird in a snowstorm. I didn't answer. I felt a wave of unease settle into the center of my chest, a heavy, cold weight that made me want to row back to the shore immediately. But the fishing at Blackwood at dawn is legendary. The bass hit almost every cast when the light is like this. I tried to talk myself out of my nerves. It's just a tourist, I told myself. Maybe someone from out of state who found the same map I did. I decided I'd stay, but I wouldn't stay in the middle of the lake. I decided to set a trot line, a long weighted line with multiple hooks, near a fallen cedar tree, and then I'd row to a different spot to see if I felt better. I spent about 10 minutes focused on the line, my back turned to the other boat. I was tying the lead weights, making sure the knots were secure. The only sound was the lap of the water against my boat and the distant, lonely cry of a loon. When I finally finished and straightened my back, I looked across the lake again to see where the stranger was. There were two of them now. They were both sitting in the same boat, perfectly still. One was in the bow, the other in the stern. They were both wearing the same dark, heavy jackets and the same wide-brimmed hats. They weren't fishing, they were both facing me, their heads tilted at the exact same angle. My heart began to beat a frantic, uneven rhythm. I knew for a fact that only one person had been in that boat 10 minutes ago. There was no way another person could have rowed out there or swam out there without me hearing a single splash. The lake was a mirror. Any movement would have sent ripples across the entire surface. I didn't think about the bass anymore. I didn't think about the trot line. I just grabbed my oars and began to paddle. I didn't want to go back to the trailhead I came from because that would mean rowing closer to them. I decided to head for a small rocky spit on the northern side of the lake, a place where I could pull the boat up and hike out through the brush. As soon as I started to paddle, I heard a sound that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It was the sound of heavy wooden oars hitting a hull. I looked over my shoulder. They were coming toward me. They weren't just rowing, they were pulling with a violent, synchronized aggression. Their boat was cutting through the water with a speed that didn't seem possible for a flat-bottomed skiff. Every time they pulled back, their oars hit the side of their boat with that rhythmic, bone-chilling thump. I dug my own oars into the water, my muscles screaming. I'm not a young man, and the adrenaline was making my hands shake so badly I could barely keep a grip on the wood. I looked back again, and this time, the light had improved just enough for me to see their faces. They didn't have expressions. Their skin looked like wet gray clay stretched tight over high cheekbones. They weren't looking at the water or their oars. They were staring at me with a singular predatory focus. I was about 50 yards from the northern shore when I felt a sudden violent jolt. My boat stopped dead. I was thrown forward, my chest hitting the rowing bench with a force that knocked the wind out of me. I looked over the side, gasping for air. My boat was snagged. An old submerged tree limb or perhaps a discarded cable had caught the rudder. I grabbed an oar and tried to push off the obstruction, but the boat was wedged tight. I looked back. The dark skiff was closing the distance. They were less than 100 yards away now. The thump of their oars was getting louder, vibrating through the water and into the floorboards of my own boat. I spent 2, maybe 3 minutes frantically trying to free myself. I was prying at the wood, sweat stinging my eyes despite the cold. But the more I pushed, the tighter the boat seemed to be held. It felt like something beneath the surface was actively pulling back. The skiff was almost on me. I could see the water curling off their bow. I didn't have a choice. I stood up, the boat rocking dangerously, and I jumped. The water was freezing, a shocking, bone-deep cold that felt like 1,000 needles pricking my skin. My heavy boots and denim jacket immediately began to pull me down. I kicked off the bottom, my lungs screaming as I breached the surface. I began to swim. I didn't use a graceful stroke. I just clawed at the water, my eyes fixed on the gray rocks of the shore. I could hear the skiff behind me. I heard the sound of their oars stopping. I looked back for a split second as I swam. One of them was standing up in the boat now. He was tall, unusually tall, and he was holding a long wooden pole with a hook on the end. The other one was still sitting, his hands resting on the oars. The current of the lake, which usually flows toward the southern outlet, was strangely working in my favor, pushing me toward the rocks. I reached the shore, my fingers slipping on the slimy stones. I hauled myself up, my clothes weighing 100 pounds, and scrambled into the thicket of laurel and pine. I didn't stop until I was 20 feet deep into the brush, hidden by the shadows. I turned around, gasping for air, my body shaking so violently I had to lean against a tree to keep from falling. The dark skiff had reached my abandoned boat. I watched as they drifted alongside it. They didn't look for me. They didn't look at the shore. They were 3 in number now. The third person was sitting in the middle of their boat where there had been nothing but empty space seconds ago. This one wasn't wearing a hat. They had long, stringy hair that hung down over their face. The one standing up took the long wooden pole and reached into my boat. He didn't grab my tackle box or my rod. He hooked the collar of my spare rain jacket, the one I'd left on the seat, and pulled it into their skiff. Then the 3 of them turned their heads and looked directly at the spot where I was hiding in the trees. They didn't move. They didn't come for me. They just sat there in the middle of the lake, holding my jacket as the fog began to settle back over the water. I ran. I didn't care about the path. I ran through the thorns and the briars until I reached the main road 3 miles away. I never went back for my boat. I never called the police. What was I going to tell them? That 3 men in a boat appeared out of nowhere and stole a rain jacket? I'm just happy I survived to safety because I can't wrap my head around what will happen if they caught up with me. The sun was sinking behind the ridgeline, turning everything purple and dim. I was about 4 miles deep into what we called the Hollow Sinks, this rough limestone gorge where the walls shoot up almost 200 feet on both sides, moss everywhere, rhododendrons so thick you could barely push through them. I was fly fishing for brook trout, working my way upstream. The water looked clear at first, but with the shadows getting long, the surface had this dull, hammered metal look to it. I had on chest waders and felt-soled boots. You need good grip out there. The rocks are slick as hell. If you've ever waded a mountain river, you know what I mean. That constant pressure against your legs, the current trying to buckle your knees. Every step has to be deliberate. I'd made it to a spot where the gorge squeezed tight, creating this deep, still pool while the rest of the river churned around it. The kind of place big fish hide. But it was quiet, unsettlingly quiet. No wind could get down into that narrow cleft, and the trees overhead were so dense they blocked out what little light was left. I cast my line, watching the fly drift toward a submerged ledge. I was locked in, focused on the tip of my rod, waiting for that telltale twitch. That's when I felt something heavy brush my left calf. Not a sharp hit, not like a branch or a rock tumbling downstream. It was slow, soft, a pressure that glided along my leg and then moved off with the current. I didn't think much of it. Mountain streams are full of junk, downed branches, brush, sometimes old tires that wash down during floods. I shifted my weight, adjusted my stance, and cast again. Figured whatever it was had floated on downstream. Maybe a minute passed. I was about to reel in when the sensation came back. Only this time, it didn't just brush past. Something heavy and solid pressed against the back of my knees and stayed there. Like a waterlogged log had wedged itself against me, held by the force of the water. I felt a slight tug on my waders. Annoyed, I reached down with my free hand. I hate snagging my gear on underwater trash. I expected to grab a rough branch and shove it away. Instead, I felt something smooth, synthetic, like heavy-duty nylon. I gave it a push. The object rolled away, drifting slowly into the deeper, darker center of the pool. I stood there, pulse starting to hammer in my neck. Something about the weight of it felt wrong. It didn't move like wood, too dense, too heavy. I reached for the headlamp clipped to my hat. I usually save it for the walk back. The light spooks fish, but the sun was almost gone and the bottom of the gorge was filling with shadows. I clicked it on. The LED beam cut through the dimness, bouncing off the surface. I scanned the water, looking for whatever I'd just pushed away. The light hit something blue about 6 feet in front of me. a backpack, large, dark blue, the kind with an external metal frame. It was submerged maybe a foot below the surface, just hanging there in the water. As I watched, it slowly turned in the current. And that's when I realized it wasn't just a lost piece of gear. Someone was wearing it. My breath caught. I froze, watched as the rest of the figure came into the light. There was a person submerged just below the surface, positioned horizontally, drifting a few inches above the riverbed, not floating the way a body normally would, being held down. I could see the straps pulled tight over a tattered gray flannel shirt. The pack looked bloated, and through the mesh pockets I could see rocks, river stones, stuffed inside to weigh it down. The head was tilted back, long matted hair fanning out like dark smoke in the water. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to claw my way up the canyon, but I was stuck in the middle of the pool, current pushing at my back. My boots felt glued to the silt. I told myself it was a body. I needed to stay calm, mark the spot, get somewhere with cell service, and call the sheriff. I started backing away, moving slow so I wouldn't lose my balance. Then the person moved. Not a thrash, not a struggle, a slow, deliberate tilt of the head. My headlamp beam caught their face, skin pale and translucent like wet paper, eyes wide open, unnaturally wide, staring straight up at me through the ripples. They weren't cloudy, not the eyes of someone who'd been dead in the water for days. They were clear, dark, focused. The person was perfectly still, pinned down by 40 or 50 pounds of rock, but they were looking at me with this calm, terrifying intensity, not gasping, not reaching for the surface, just waiting. As I stared, paralyzed, their mouth opened slightly in a way that is not really noticeable. Then a single large bubble escaped, wobbling to the surface and popping with a soft sound that echoed off the stone walls. They were still alive. Pure terror hit me like a fist. This wasn't a drowning victim. This was something else. Someone had deliberately weighted themselves down. Or worse, someone had put them there, and they'd just accepted it. "Do you need help?" I croaked. My voice sounded wrong in the quiet. The person didn't blink. Their gaze stayed locked on mine, drifting slightly as the current shifted the backpack. Then they started to lift one hand, slow, graceful, fingers long and blue-tinged, reaching toward my boots. I didn't wait to see what happened next. I turned and lunged for the bank, water splashing in my face. Waiting in a hurry is a nightmare. The resistance feels like hands grabbing your legs trying to pull you under. I slipped on a mossy rock, knee slamming into limestone, but I didn't feel it. I just scrambled, using my hands to haul myself over boulders. I hit the narrow shore and kept going, ran through the brush, rhododendron branches tearing at my jacket, scratching my face. I didn't look back, didn't want to see a pale, wet face emerging from that dark pool. I made the 4-mile hike back to my truck in record time, lungs burning, legs like lead, but fear's a hell of a fuel. I didn't feel safe until I was behind the wheel, doors locked, engine roaring. I drove straight to the police station in the nearest town. I was a wreck, soaking wet, covered in mud, shaking so hard I could barely get the words out. I told the officer at the desk what I'd seen, the backpack, the stones, the eyes. He didn't look shocked. He looked tired. "The hollow sinks?" he asked, leaning back in his chair. "Yeah," I said, still trying to catch my breath. 4 miles in, deep pool by the Narrows. He sighed, rubbed his temples. "You're the 3rd person this year to report someone under the water in that gorge. We sent a dive team up there in July after a couple hikers saw something similar. Spent 2 days searching that pool and the ones downstream." "And?" he said. "Nothing. No backpack, no stones, no body, just deep silt and some old timber. "I saw him," I insisted, voice rising. "He looked at me. He was breathing. He had air. He was weighted down." The officer leaned forward. His expression softened a little. "Look, I believe you saw something, but people go into those mountains for all kinds of reasons. Some don't want to be found. And some of them move through those woods in ways that don't make sense to folks like you and me. My advice? Find a new fishing spot. The sinks have a way of getting into your head." I never went back. Sold my fly fishing gear a week later. People ask why I stopped. I tell them I lost interest. That's a lie. Truth is, I can't stand the sound of rushing water anymore. Every time I hear it, I'm back in that gorge. I feel that heavy, soft pressure against my knees. And I think about those eyes. They weren't pleading, weren't full of fear, just watching, like I was the one trespassing in a world I was never supposed to see. I had nightmares for a couple weeks, but I think I'm getting over it now.